Hi, welcome back. To another chilly Monday in material text territory. Nice to have you all in person and online. I'm John Pollack. I'm one of the organizers of the seminar. Nice to see some old friends. Welcome back in the room and plenty of folks on Zoom as well. This is, I think, week 4, something like that, for our semester. If there are any newcomers, our requests are very limited. There's a sign-in sheet going around, and please add your email in if you'd like to receive a small but important number of messages from Peter Diamond, the seminars coordinator, who's the MC of technology and other things for us. If you Zoomers would like to be added to the listserv as well, put your name in the chat, send Peter an email, contact us any way you like. My fellow organizers are Professor Zach Lesser from the English department, Jerry Singerman, Humanities Editor Emeritus of the Penn Press. And we are in the 30-something year of the seminar, who knows at this point. But great to have you all with us as we make, I think, over the next couple of weeks, what we might call a little bit of an eastward turn. And there's a nice synergy, or a little bit of a synergy, perhaps, between James's talk tonight, which I'll get to in 1 second, and our speaker next week, who is Georgios Boudalis from Greece, who will be talking about the late antique and books and scrolls. So we're sticking with the early periods for the next couple of weeks, although perhaps refracted through scholarship and interpretation as well. So we have Georgios next week. After that, Shakespeare and Food with Marissa Nicosia. And then, just so you folks who like to plan things are aware, there's no meeting of the seminar during Penn's spring break, which this year is the week of March 10th. Any other announcements or important details that anyone would like to share about upcoming events?
There's John, the exhibit.
Yes, well, it's off topic, but I will mention it anyway. So there's a new exhibit that's just opened in the Kislak Center, opened at the end of last week. It's called Revolution at Penn, and there's a question mark at the end of that. And it's a show about this university and its misadventures in the second half of the 18th century, particularly during the Revolution, the upending of the school during the tumultuous years of the 1750s through 90s. So the show is in the Goldstein Gallery, which is, I'm facing it directly. It's on the in the corner of the 6th floor in the Kislak Center.
It's not off topic, it's print material.
Printed.
It features Ben Franklin.
Ben Franklin, of course, how could we not? Ben Franklin is as ever a star. Lots of print and manuscript material from Penn's collections and from the university archives. So yes, very much as material texty as we could make it. And there is also a special feature which is outside the gallery and open whenever this building is open. It's a replica of an 18th century coffee house. So if you'd like to debate revolution with your friends, or really, I don't know, do business, do whatever you like, do your accounting homework, please use that space, and it's kind of fun.
How long is the exhibit open?
The exhibit is on through the end of May and will possibly be extended a little after that. So it's here all semester, open 10 to 5, weekends and tours by arrangement with me. Please let me know if you'd like to bring groups, friends, enemies, whatever. Okay. But now on to the main event. James, it's really a pleasure to have you. I should say that tonight's event, happily, is a co-organized project with the Middle East Center and its new director, Paul Cobb, who's here tonight, and the newly renamed MELC Department, Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Excellent, with the right plurals and everything. Excellent. I worked on that. And we're very happy to help co-sponsor James's brief visit, at which he will also be presenting for the center. James, as you may have read, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of History and Sociology at Konstanz, University of Konstanz in Germany. And his PhD is from London, from Queen Mary, just a few years back in 2020. I did want to mention this important new book that James has just published. It's called Medieval Syria and the Onset of the Crusades. That came out in 2023. I think tonight's talk will be connected with the next phases in this work. One of the things that book does, which is so important, is it tries to help us narrate the Crusades from the Syrian perspective. Particularly, I think, before and after the First Crusade in particular. And I imagine that the problematic nature of working with the sources from both sides is a crucial issue there. And I would like to talk to James about what the recent developments in Syrian politics might have to do with future scholarship, but that's probably a conversation for another session. James is a new friend of ours, and I'm only just getting to know his work, but I would just like to conclude with some observations about how it's great to have a younger scholar here at Penn doing what, even if he doesn't totally realize, actually connects with a long tradition of certain kinds of work that have happened in this, not exactly in this very room, but on this floor of the library, and particularly in the famous Henry Charles Lee Library over there. Lee himself, a scholar of Catholicism, wasn't that interested in the Crusades, as far as we know, although he did do some work on medieval France and the Franks, at least earlier in his life. He ended up focusing mainly on Spain and the Inquisitions. That was his major life project. But it is interesting that after the Lee Library came to Penn in the 1920s, subsequent generations of scholar curators and librarian curators were deeply interested in the Crusades. And I think Paul can correct me if I'm wrong here, that it's fair to say that the dominant monumental 20th century history of the Crusades in 6 or 7 volumes, edited by Ken Seton, kind of was born here. Seton was actually a curator of the Lee Library as well as a historian at Penn. And Seton did something that even librarians today are not allowed to do. He snuck some of his own books into the shelves of the Lee Library. So there's a little bit of anachronism there. Not every single book in there was put there by Henry Charles Lee. A few came in thanks to Seton later. And he finished that work ultimately at Wisconsin, where he moved to. But I do think it's safe to say that our collections here are fundamental for the 20th century historiography of the Crusades. Seton's successor as Henry Charles Lee Professor of History was someone who was known to a number of us. And I wanted to mention this because I wanted to pay a very brief tribute to Professor Ed Peters, who passed away late last year. I don't even know if everyone knows this. It wasn't widely circulated. Ed was a good friend to many of us here, and as I said, the curator of the Henry Charles Lee Library, the scholar, historian in residence for most of his career at Penn, which started in the 1970s. Famously, Ed edited a reader, and Jerry published a reader called The First Crusade, which I have used in teaching classes, and I believe is still the standard, even if perhaps too Western in its focus. We could hear about this from James. I'm glad to have James here tonight because I feel like it represents an important continuation of the conversation on the Crusades within our walls. So welcome to James and his talk tonight. Let me get the title right. Joseph Chahin, a Syrian Maronite merchant, and the Recueil des Historiens des Croisades. Thank you, James, for being with us.
I think I've done everything. Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction and for tying my own work in with such great figures. And of course, I use this exact text to teach the Crusades. I have done since my bachelor's, used this text and Setton's text as well. So it's a real privilege to be here today. Thank you to Zachary Lester, John Pollock, and Jerry Zingerman, of course, for inviting me, and of course, as co-organizers, Peter for organizing all the administrative things relating to my visit, and of course, Paul Cobb for providing me with a home away from home whilst I'm here. So yes, I'm going to talk about a Syrian Maronite merchant or scribe called Joseph Chahin. In terms of chronology, he was operating in France, in Paris, from around 1769 to 1776. So it does fit in with the chronology of the coffee house in the back. So perfect continuation. And yeah, so he's someone who I feel was very important in this mass source compilation project, which we can see on the table before us, which basically forms the foundation of modern Crusade studies. So without further ado, I will just go into a summary of how I'm going to present this. If I make this smaller, I'll make it easier. So I'm just going to introduce the Recueil des Historiens de Crusades and what they are for people who are not Crusade historians who don't know or don't have as much familiarity with them. And then I'm going to do a partial reconstruction of Joseph Chahin's life as far as I've been able to do that with the sources that I have. And then a little bit of a discussion of the legacy of his work. And this will be the longest part of the talk. Okay, so what are the Recueil des Historiens de Crusades, Historiens Orientaux? So they are 5 volumes of abridged abridged Arabic editions and French translations of sources relating to the Crusades. So generally historiographical sources, mainly local chronicles, great universal histories, or in some cases biographies, and in one case a travel journal. So because they contain 15 different chronicles written by 12 different authors, and some of these translations are still used even today to write the history of the Crusades. So that's a really important point about the project. This is what it sort of looks like on a wide scale, going through the different volumes. So really, I would group them into the first 2 volumes, which are mainly dedicated to the work of Ibn al-Athir, and the volume 4 and 5, which are dedicated to Abu Shama's Kitab al-Rawdatain fi Akhbar Dawlatain, which means the Book of the Two Gardens of the Two Reigns. So it's basically biographical. It's biographies of the 2 reigns of Nur ad-Din and Salah ad-Din, who are the main Muslim counter-crusading figures of the 12th century. So these are the people who led the fight back against the Crusaders. And then we sort of have this hodgepodge collection in volume 3, which has lots of different shorter extracts sort of compiled together. And that's sort of the structure of it, okay? And although we have these lovely copies here in front of us today, which are from I think, the original 19th century publication, this is how it looks today for most Crusade historians who use it. They would just go on to Archive or Gallica and just download the entire PDF, and very easy access. And this is also a big strength of the collection, that it's so accessible. I try to quantify how important it is, right? And it's very difficult because different historians use different abbreviations or different versions, but yeah, so I just typed the Recueil d'Historien de Crusades into Google Scholar and it came up with over 5,000 hits, okay? And I also did WorldCat just to sort of demonstrate the physical copies and the long-term usage over time. And here we have 182 results, okay? So it's hugely popular in terms of the references and in terms of the physical copies that are kept. I'm sure there might be better bibliometrical metrics you can use now, and I would be happy to discuss that with the people, with the audience afterwards. So during this project, which I sort of intend to be a second book project, I've sort of identified three stages of the Recueil's development. So the first one is from 1670 onwards, where you start getting the collection of Arabic manuscripts in European libraries on a more organized scale. Okay, so it starts being more systematic, and that's under Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the first minister to Louis XV, France. And then we sort of have the second stage, which is the Maoist monks of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, who worked on this during the 18th century, and this is what I'll focus on today. And then we have the most famous phase of it under the Académie d'Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, which is sort of where the famous Orientalists like Sylvestre de Sacy, Joseph Renaud, Etienne Quatremer, these guys evolved. But this is the most studied aspect, but generally speaking, the project is not that well studied at all, just to give you that idea. So I will start now and just explain who Dom Berthereau and Joseph Chahine were, because he's the main figure I'm focusing on. So the Maoist phase I just described to you can sort of be split up into two different phases. So the first one is from 1739 onwards, and this is a couple of Maoists who started trying to learn Arabic in order to start engaging with the Arabic manuscripts. And they didn't really produce anything, but what happened was that we get more manuscripts arriving in Paris at this time, and this is what they were mainly used for. And then we sort of have the second Maoist phase from 1769 onwards. And this is where we get Dom Berthereau, who was appointed to oversee the project. So he oversaw Armenian, Latin, Greek, and Arabic texts. The only real problem was he could not read Arabic. Okay, so this is very clear. So we have to find a solution for this problem, and this is where Youssef Chahine comes into the picture. He arrives in Paris in around 1769, and he produced copies of the Arabic manuscripts. So it's copies of extracts or sections of the manuscripts, which were then used later to compile the collection in front of us. So this is the sort of current thinking on who Chahine is and his what he did. And so he is mentioned in the first volume of the Recueil, and he's just described here as a hired scribe of Dom Berthereau. Yeah, that's the language which is used. Yeah. Yeah, you can see my mouse. Yeah, that's good. And then we also have opinions from Sylvestre de Sacy, who knew Dom Berthereau. Berthereau was the person who introduced de Sacy to Arabic. Okay, so he knew him, and yeah, he's very dismissive of him. He says, if one can, yeah, so chance provided him in the course of, so meaning Berthereau, in the course of his labors with a collaborator, if one can use this term here, who made him pay very dearly through his villainous vices, his laziness, and all the kinds of depravity that ordinarily accompany those with the taste for a wandering vagabond lifestyle. So rather brutal description of his scholarly output. And this sort of gets at the unconventional route in which Chahine entered into Berthereau's entourage, okay? So there's a good amount of scholarship and French scholarship on the so-called invisible Easterners, these sorts of Near Eastern scholars who arrived in Europe and facilitated European Orientalist projects. So we have chronologically speaking, we have the foundation of the Maronite College of Rome in 1584, and this is sort of seen as ironically linking back to the crusading past and these people who helped us then, and now the papacy then installs this Maronite College in Rome. And then we also have very famous examples like Hannah Diab, who was affiliated with Antoine Galland in the 1001 Nights project, and these sorts of people, right? So Shaheen, I've managed to find out by looking at some travel letters, actually did not follow this more established route into European Orientalist circles. He was actually a merchant who entered into the entourage, again, it's very vague how this happens, of a Swedish Orientalist named Jakob Jonas Björnstad. And he writes in one of his letters, I have provided him, Berterol, with an Arab who came here last year after a shipwreck and who, in order to help me read the difficult Arabic manuscripts, works with me every day. He does the same thing with Berterol and transcribes the illegible manuscripts that are found in the libraries that relate to the Crusades. His name is Yusuf Shaheen. He was a merchant in Syria who was shipwrecked in the Mediterranean Sea and is now beginning to speak a little French and is therefore becoming more useful. He has nothing else to do here and therefore has a good deal of time to give me lessons in Arabic. Typical of the style of the time. But interesting in this sort of helps to contextualize the Sessi's criticism of someone who might not have the typical scholarly bona fides that he would expect, right? So we can see from the documents surviving in the archive in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France that Shaheen worked for other people as an Arabic teacher. We can see here, familiar to Arabists will be the Arabic alphabet here. And also some letters. I won't read the whole letter, but it's basically from a German Orientalist called Schnürer, who talks about taking Arabic lessons with Shaheen and sitting up and reading 1001 Nights with him, and so sort of like a Hannah Diab cosplay or recreation of this previous relationship, right? So it's super interesting, of course. But again, it just confirms that he's also at the service of visiting scholars who are coming to Paris during this time and performing this service. But most of what I'm interested in Shaheen is for his editorial work, okay? And this was also highly valued in the private correspondence of Sylvestre de Sacy, who praised the 1,100 pages of Arabic extracts which Shaheen produced, okay? And you can see here in this image on the top right how they sort of took this collection in the 19th century and sort of glued it all together, all of the different chronicles on top of each other. And this is something interesting for material text people, I think. And also here you can sort of see how when an important section is missing or there's too many errors that need to be corrected, then what they will do is sort of copy on top of it, right? And correct. So the text, they're really interesting to just interact with, you know, because you have these like, what's this section suddenly stuck in here and things like this. There are also glosses. This gloss in particular is a correction here. Again, I won't go into the grammatical detail, but the important point here is that the gloss was made by, again, Sylvestre de Sacy. And you can see here that someone later has annotated. This is de Sacy's annotation. And then de Sacy used, what this means basically is de Sacy used Shaheen's copies to produce his first translation of an Arabic text, okay? And this is Ibn al-Adim's Zubda. And he completed this sometime prior to 1811 when he gave it to a German Crusade historian. So I promised that I would demonstrate that Shaheen in some way shaped the collection. And I think this is the most obvious way in which you can see this, okay? So the green bars relate to pages in the Recueil. and the yellow relates to folios in Shaheen's copies. And the main point here is that of the 15 texts in the Recueil, 12 of them were Shaheen produced copies of 12 of them, so 12 out of 15. And the 3 that he didn't provide extracts of were later translations or used by the 19th century scholars in their teaching. Okay, so it was just a convenience thing for those that weren't. And also the text where he produced the longest extracts, so Abu Shama, Ibn al-Athir, Ibn Shaddad, and Ibn al-Adim, these are all some of the longest extracts in the collection. Okay, so he very much shaped what the collection looks like. And I think you can see, I showed it briefly on the slide, but forgot to mention it, but you can see that one of the rare things about the Recueil is that you have the Arabic edition on top and then the translation underneath. Okay, so producing the edition takes a long time. So if you already have this preparatory work, then this can really facilitate how quickly something can be produced. But I would also like to point out that there is omission. He does cut large sections out. So you can see here, 593, 594, 595, 599. Okay, so this is huge. This is about 7 years covered in about 10 lines. You can see the dots as well where he's noted omission. And so I would say that based upon my interaction with the texts and the translations, I would say that they did go beyond his preparatory work as well. So I want to make that clear. It's not just that they took his stuff and then translated it. They also occasionally went beyond when they thought it was important enough. Okay. And this leads us on to how his work was used, basically. And a big thing with the Recueil when I was using it and analyzing it was the sections that are not included, right? What parts of the text are cut out and which are not. And here you can see this section. Here's the original manuscript of one text, and you can see this section from this red arrow until this red arrow is just represented by this full stop in the Recueil. Okay, so there's no indication of what's being cut out, why, what's been left out, and this is also in a continuation of the translation of this text by a later 19th century scholar called Edgar Blocher. Okay, so I started counting. What is cut out, what is not, how can we quantify this in a clear way? So I focus mainly on one text, which is Ibn al-Adim's Zukunftskolleg al-Haleb, min Tarikh Haleb, which is the cream of the milk of the history of Aleppo. And yeah, you can see, so the approximate word count is 114,000 words. And just by focusing on the crusading period, they cut out around 47% of the text, right, which is quite a significant amount. But even here, yeah, the Recueil just translates the first 50 years of the crusading period. So yeah, there's 17% of the text, but they only cut out a very small amount actually of this text. But when I went into the Blocher continuation, which is for another 100 years, basically, we can see that the rate of omission goes up very high to like 24% of the text. And this is important because these translations are still used by non-Arabists all the time to write the history of the Crusades. But of course, I have to contextualize this by saying that omission is something which is common in these sorts of 19th century compilation projects like the MGH, the Recueil d'Historiens de Gales et de France, and the British Rolls series. Another very specific technical aspect is the translation of specific terms, okay? So in this example, I have the translation of a suffixed pronoun. The Arabic word here is liharpum, which means to make war on them. And in the French translation, it is translated as pour combattre l'ennemi. So to fight the enemy. Okay, so this vague term is translated and imposed with this sort of meaning. And then I had to count how frequently this happens. So the original Arabic term Ibn al-Adim is used twice. References to the enemy in translation, though, it is 33 times. So it's inserted frequently into Muslim Crusader contexts. And this also happens with other texts, particularly Ibn al-Athir's Al-Kamil. So how does this look over time? You can see that it actually corresponds to standard crusading historiography. So here's the First Crusade, here's the Second Crusade, here's the Third Crusade, Fourth Crusade, here's the Fifth Crusade, and you can also see the counter-crusade narrative is therefore imposed. So we have initial disunity followed by this career of Nur ad-Din, the career of Salah ad-Din, and these sorts of things reinforce macro narratives that we use all the time in our research and how we frame books and research on these things. And finally, I wanted to say that there's one very positive thing, which they did manage to translate quite effectively, and this is the concept of provincialism. So the Zubda is one of the earliest local histories that is translated into French or into a European language. And basically what I think of the main important, using Hayden White's theory of emplotment, is that the main focus of the text is provincialism, so attachment or loyalty to one's own province or region, its institutions, interests, etc., etc. And this they do manage to translate quite well. And you can actually see, based upon, and this is something I've worked on less, but something which I hope to build up more, is the idea that Crusade historians understood this term through the translations and then applied it to Crusade studies, okay? So in this case, we have the first real history of the Crusades, written by a German scholar called Friedrich Wilken. This is what Christopher Treiman judges to be the first ever Crusade history, okay? Or the first scholarly 19th century history of the Crusades, of course. It's not the first book written on the Crusades, but the first scholarly attempt to do so. And the point here is that Wilken traveled to Paris in 1811 and was given a copy of de Sassy's translation that we discussed earlier and used it in his text. And so instead of the grand narrative that we normally see about crusading, we instead see, even though it's arranged according to the chronology of the kings of Jerusalem, there are separate chapters dedicated to the history of Antioch. So it's sort of split up into the different sections, and this influenced how Crusade studies then developed in the 19th century, and we see histories of the county of Edessa, of Tripoli, of Jerusalem, and this sort of developed into the 19th and 20th century, and brings us back to Setton's volume, where he has sections on Antioch, on Jerusalem, and these sorts of things. So this is sort of the end of my talk. So the conclusions which I have is that I view Shaheen more as an 18th century facilitator of an 18th century project, which became this project, rather than an invisible Easterner, because he is mentioned in the introduction and these sorts of things. But his preparatory work did shape the Recueil in multiple ways, but particularly in terms of the format of it takes today. And also his work was used in some problematic ways, which have influenced the field, but also the question of provincialism and whether or not this was imbued into the study of the Crusades through this work. Okay, so thank you for your time.
The floor is open for questions. Liliana Weisberg, the first question.
Thank you so much. I have a question that is totally out there,
Great.
and I have to apologize in advance for this. And then I have another question which goes to the matter of material text. The question that is out there is, you're spelling the name Shaheen in very different ways. And I am not a scholar of Arabic, and I am not a scholar of the Crusades, but Shaheen may be a Jewish name. And I don't know what you know about this man, but if indeed my suspicion is right, and I apologize that I'm out there, it might actually be a much more interesting history, biographically speaking, than it seems here on the surface, and not unusual if you think about Jewish Arabics. It's just the Crusades that's so exciting here. But I want to bring it back to material texts because you have done a lot of, and I don't want to say it negatively, but number crunching. So we know how many percentage of this and percentage of this and percentage of this. And I have kind of problems visualizing the collection now. And I would very much like to push you a little bit in telling us, what does collection mean for you at that time? And how does this particular collection compare to other Arabic text collections, maybe not about the Crusades, but about Islam or something else at that time? So can you contextualize it a little bit?
Yes. Okay. So on the spelling of Shaheen, yeah, I think you're correct. There are two different spellings which I use. One of them is correct transliteration of the Arabic, which would have the full transliteration in an SH, and then one is CH, which is influenced by the French transliteration styles, which is just the normal thing which Crusade historians are used to. So I think it's just a problem of formatting on the possible Jewish nature of Shaheen, or background or heritage, or however we want to frame it. He is clearly identified as a Maronite, okay, by multiple sources, including Sylvestre de Sacy, who knew him. So that does not mean that his family were not Jewish or anything like this. Of course, this is all I know about him. I'm being completely transparent here, so I cannot answer beyond this, okay? On the meaning of collection, I suppose I came into the project with quite a negative view of collection in this period. I think that's fair to say, that I viewed it just as a way of shaping a historical scholarship. And but I'd say over time working on it, I have a much more sympathetic view of this as sort of service. This is a very, very hard task, I think, even in 19th century. In the 19th century, I think, yeah, the how I contextualize this with other Arabic collections, I would say that the Recueil, the Historien de Crusades, is quite unique in terms of a collection of Arabic texts related to one subject, which are then translated into French in this sort of thematic way. If you understand, so there are other huge translation projects, of course, like Ibn Khaldun's work. There's a whole bunch of philosophical texts. Of course, there's a whole sort of agricultural tradition of Kitab al-Filaha, and all of these things, which are all translated at around the same time. There's legal texts that are translated, which again have their own, you know, colonial tinge. Not to get at. I think that the Recueil is interesting because it's something that was commissioned 3 years after the French invasion of Algeria to understand Frankish Muslim history and victory and all these sorts of themes as well, right? And this also comes into this collection specifically. So I'd say it's a really complex history. It's a really complex task. But I do think that there are unique nationalist and medievalist tendencies which went into the editing of this collection too.
So Jerry and then Dave.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. You said that you would end the talk with talking about the influence of the text. I'm wondering, the Recueil in French, has it been translated into other languages? What is the status of the text in English or Italian or German, whatever? And do the translations go back to the Arabic sources, or are we looking, if there are translations, are they translations of the French texts, which themselves are imperfect renderings of the Arabic texts? So I mean, that seems problematic for scholarship.
Yeah.
Talking about the influence of the Recueil in
Of
particular.
course. So I would say that there are only really 3 long texts which are still used regularly. So, for example, one of the texts was translated into English very soon after in the early 20th century.
From the French.
From the French, directly from the French. So that's Bahauddin ibn Shaddad's History of Salahuddin. But so this text, Bahauddin ibn Shaddad's text, Ibn al-Athir, has been retranslated. So it's only really Abu Shama, Ibn al-Adim, and one other text of Ibn al-Athir that's still regularly cited. I think Paul can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think these are the main 3 that are still used today.
And follow-up question. So Shaheen was transcribing a single manuscript, or so what is the critical textual situation of those texts that are still being used? Has there been philological work done on the Arabic sources, or
no?
Is that still to be done?
The manuscript is sort of a problem anyway, because they cut certain corners in terms of they used the text or the manuscript that they had there. If there was an edition, which even an edition produced in the Arabic speaking world, they would use it, which is interesting. But they did not consult every single manuscript relating to, I think, so for example, Abu Shama's, there's at least 20 Arabic manuscripts today, and they were known about at the time that they were working on it, but they, cut certain corners or got copies of one manuscript, the oldest manuscripts, basically. What Shaheen was doing, he was looking at multiple manuscripts of at least 12 texts. And some of the texts also did not make it into the collection that he produced editions of. And then there were other translations produced by students of the SESI, which were published.
So I'm sorry. So what do we know if Shaheen was looking at multiple manuscripts of the same text? What do we know about his editorial principles and dealing with variants or lacunae? Or I mean, he's not a scholar, and yet that is very serious philological work, as would be done in serious ways in certainly in 19th century France. Later in the century, not so much in 18th century. But he's
I'd say he falls into the same category, because I agree that, of course, if you look at the Occidental volumes, the Western volumes, there's a completely different, principle at stake, which is that we consult every single manuscript and we know what they are. But I think for the Oriental volumes, there's this feeling, at least, that these are the manuscripts we have in Paris, and we have to do them before someone else does them, if this makes sense. So there's this sort of, need to do it as fast as possible.
And working with what's there, even if they knew about something else.
Yes, basically. So, and I would say that Shaheen falls into this category more, that he was working with a set list of manuscripts relating to a series of texts.
But he's not creating a stemma or whatever.
No, I don't think so.
It is kind of a funny image, though. It feels like this guy, just fell off a boat, and, suddenly, hey, you're the editor in charge. Got nothing to do.
And this is precisely the time in France that, medievalists are doing serious philological work on manuscripts, right? And this guy is an amateur who's not doing that kind of serious philological work in the time and place, right?
Yeah, but
Same
he has
time and place.
the linguistic skills to do it as good as is possible. I mean, this is immediately preceding the French Revolution and stuff like this.
Okay,
as well.
so he's doing it in the 18th century. He's not doing
Yeah.
it in the 19th.
No, he's doing
Okay.
it in
So,
the
yeah, the
17th
philology
century.
is later. Okay.
I have some questions about this, but David, please go ahead.
Well, following on from that line of thinking, it's interesting that this translator is not assimilable to, in a sense, of French. It can't be naturalized as French in some way. There's a contrast to Bédier, for example, who comes from Réunion, right? And he goes to the Metropole. He really becomes a tremendously authoritative figure.
Yeah.
Doesn't he? With tremendous authority. But this guy cannot be accorded. It's fished out of the ocean.
Basically, yeah.
It's not. It goes with the theory that it's the colonial periphery which reinforces the center. But of course, it's not coming from a French colony, right? So that's one thing that's interesting. The other thing was this day supplements what Liliana saying. 1872 is so interesting because of Algeria, right? And in the light of the defeat at the hands of Prussia, right? Is this sort of like a conscious competitor to the Monumenta Germanica? And this is part of the strategy that's often articulated in France that we may lose to Germany, but we revenge ourselves through the colonies. You know, we have a reach that's longer than the Germans can possibly have.
Okay. Yes. I'm not sure. So this specific collection emerged out of the history of the historians of France. Okay. So this is, and I know that this series is at least 18th century in origin. And so there was going to be one special volume of Arabic historians of the Crusades, which would go within maybe 2 total volumes of Crusades histories, right? So I'd say it was not inspired by the MGH. I know that when I'm not even sure exactly when the MGH is started. I think it's a 19th century project in my head, at least. Yeah. I know, for example, that the British Rolls series was also directly inspired by the Recueil des Historiens de France. Yeah. So and there's some scholarship done on that. So I think it's more likely that the MGH was sort of inspired by this Maoist Benedictine tradition, which started in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in this time.
Please, and then Rita, sorry.
Yeah, we were talking about omissions that when the print edition came to be, had to be filled in from Shaheen's work. And I wondered if it ever goes the other way, where we have evidence of Shaheen putting significant work into things that then have to be excised by the time the print editors come onto the scene. I have to imagine, especially in like Mara circles, there's got to be a tremendous demand to have this man, look over all these hagiographic manuscripts coming into the libraries there, right? All of the non-Crusade things. It seems impossible that he's not working on that kind of stuff. So do we see that being trend prior to the Crusadification of the print project?
Yeah, I suppose I should be clear that also the 19th century scholars did have access to all the manuscripts that Shaheen did, right? So, and they did consult the manuscripts as well. So I should be clear on this. Also, there are some texts that he produced editions of that are not in the Recueil. Yes, I cannot speak to how valued he was in Saint-Germain-des-Prés or among the Maoist community there, because I have not done any archival work on texts he might have looked at or things like this, but I think it's an interesting subject for further research. Yeah.
So let's take Rita and then we'll go to Zoom. Go ahead, Rita.
Thank you. So when you talked about him as an invisible facilitator, it makes me think about the circles of translation in Toledo in the 12th century, where what we posit anyway is that there are people sitting more or less together, each at a desk, so that if they're translating Al-Farabi, the Muslim scholar will say, this is what he says here, and then the guy puts it into Latin. So there's interestingly about that structure, collaboration, is that from the Latin side, it's entirely, if you like, appropriative. All they want to do is extract the stuff. They leave the Arabic behind. They cite, they name him as Al-Farabi, but otherwise they utterly leave the Arabic behind. And whoever it was who was facilitating, as far as I know, is not known to us. Perhaps you know more about this. But what's interesting here, so first of all, I wondered about the very structure of collaboration. Are there points at which they are actually sitting together? Is he actually helping them with the translation, or are they just taking the texts and translating themselves? And then ultimately, he does leave a distinctive trace because they do bother to print the Arabic.
Yeah.
So it's not, I mean, invisible it's interesting to call it invisible. And I assume that his name does not come up in the editions, right? It's through all of the researchers around the editions that you know about. So anyway, so it's the structure of collaboration I'm thinking about.
He is named in
He's
the
named,
first volume, just like a hired scribe of the guy in charge of the project, basically. So
Is his role simply scribal, or is he also helping with translation, helping with let's say verbal context and so on?
okay, yeah. So Berterot produced Latin translations, which the 19th century historians viewed as useless.
Yeah.
And they described it that way. Okay, so I think how his work was judged in the 19th century was that the value lay in the editions or the copies. Okay, actually, maybe shouldn't use editions because this confuses medievalists with proper ideas of what an edition is. So I think copies of these manuscripts. Okay, so in terms of the comparison with Toledo and the 12th century, I also spoke recently to someone who's working on exactly this. And I think one of the interesting things are these individuals who play these roles at the start of these massive translation movements. So of course, in 12th century Toledo, this leads to like the development of universities in Europe in a certain way, right? You can make this argument. And here again, we have someone working in the 18th century who then is interacting with people like Sylvestre de Sacy, like the founding father of modern Oriental studies, right? And this is also very interesting. So invisible or visible or not, I think they're still important figures, right? In that's why I try to use this term facilitator rather than but yeah, it's really interesting comparison.
I guess the minor question, but did he just hand over the texts and then they went off by themselves, or do we know if they sat together?
Okay, I think that they definitely sat together to learn Arabic or to teach them Arabic, and I think there must have been some sort of collaboration, but I don't think Shaheen, who couldn't speak French, could do Latin translations.
And then there's an additional problem, like the texts he produced sit around for 75 years, 100 years before they are then recovered and turned into this thing. It took me a sort of temporal moment to understand the big distance between that 18th century, whatever it was, and their production much later.
Yes, yeah, and they have to be bought because Berterot's ancestors take them and then don't give them to the French state straight away, and then they have to pay a huge amount to get them.
Okay, additional rub. So lots of stories there. Okay, let's go to Zoom. And Rayhan, hi, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this delightful conversation and this great talk. I enjoyed it so much. My question is admittedly going to be one of those what about X questions that are tangential, but I hope to be able to just address a piece of the puzzle here. When you were mentioning the vague category of invisible Easterners, I thought about one of the very famous Maronite scholar, Joseph Assemani, who is collecting Syriac manuscripts early 18th century and cataloging them and bringing them to the Vatican. So in relation to that giant name and the manuscript collection and translation happening very close to Joseph Shaheen's time and place, I'm just wondering if there is any indication that there is any connection to Syriac literature and especially Syriac Crusader literature that is being transmitted through Şahin et al.? Is he using language similar to, for example, those Eastern Christian sources who represent Crusades quite different ways than Latin ones? So I think this is just a long way of asking, where are the Syriac Christians through the lens of this work that you are doing, if there is any indication or clue at all? And thank you again for this delightful conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I would say that it's funny that Assemani comes up because the French king approached him to lead the project at one point, which was also really interesting. That's
wow, great.
Yeah, so that's Louis XV who wrote this. But I think there's not a lot of interest in Syriac literature from what I've found. It's more the Armenian stuff, and particularly Matthew of Edessa, that they are very interested in from the 18th century onwards. I know it's not the same, but Crusade historians just jumble it all together. And it's not, it's a distinct literary tradition that is not exactly the same, but I've not seen any interest. I think Chabot is the guy doing it in the 19th century, and this is very much a distinct project away from the Recueil. Yeah.
Zach.
I just wanted to, again, from very much outside the field, but this guy, Şahin, it's such, I mean, it's like a story out of a Greek romance or like a Shakespearean romance. I mean, he's like shipwrecked,
Yeah,
he's a merchant, then he's rising to, you know.
That's how I got this job.
Yeah, you know, he's like, he rises up to be hanging out with
nothing to
these
do.
figures of France, and he's trying, you know. And I just, are there ways that you could do, I'm sure you've looked, but do you have ideas for leads, for ways to find out more biographical information about him? I mean, if he's a merchant, are there, you know, a customs record, you know, lading, ships lading, just all, I don't know, the ship is shipwrecked, so there must be some, you know, claims. Do we know what the ship was called? Because that part of the story, I think there's something really exciting about this guy who is an amateur, you know, I mean, he knows Arabic, like that's what he's got. He's not a teacher of Arabic, but he becomes one. He's not a scribe, he becomes one. He's not a translator, he sort of helps. I mean, I know he's not actually doing the translation, but just a very interesting guy. And it's a kind of it's a very interesting story of migration and social transformation, right, in this period. And I just wonder if there's some way to get more of him.
Yeah, I was really frustrated because I did try. I mean, I'm not an expert in early modern French archives or early modern archives in Aleppo or the Syrian coastal cities. So there's a limit to what I could do on my own. But yeah, it might be worth reaching out to some people who do very specific work on these sorts of connections and asking about these sorts of sources. And
Doesn't it just seem like a fairy tale out of a romance just to explain the appearance of a person?
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah, right, okay. One could be skeptical.
Yeah.
Is there a Maronite community in Paris at this time?
Oh, in the 18th century.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering that too.
I don't know. I'll be honest, I have not thought of that. So.
Yeah. So please, question in the back. Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks for this talk. I was curious. So I really enjoyed the slide you had with showing the usage of the word enemy in the Arabic and in the French, and how that's kind of shaping the way the narrative comes across by introducing this term. But in the original Arabic, there's a very large spike in the usage of enemy in the 13th century of Al-Budi's text. And I was just wondering if you have any sense of, what is he doing with the concept of the enemy in that late Crusades context, and how is his narrative different from what's being shaped by the French translators?
Yeah. So in this example, this coincides with the Fifth Crusade. And my original thought, because it's Ibn al-Athir, that graph, is that it was his lived experience of crusading. So maybe this caused him to do this, but I spoke to someone a colleague in our field, and he said there's a huge section of reported speech. So this is like a dialogue of someone specifically addressing this period and describing what's going on. And in this section, the enemy, the phrase al-adu, is repeated again and again and again. And this is what he felt.
Quoting someone who had maybe a different perspective. than
Yes.
he himself did.
Away from his more compilatory style for the earlier Crusader period.
That's another question. This one.
Yeah, yeah.
This one's actually about material text,
I've got some too.
not just my article with this guy. But how are they printing the
Yeah,
books? Because
the
I'm assuming they
lithographic
don't have movable type for the Arabic. So is it engraved? I mean, that's a tricky, if it's
need
engraved
to-
on the top and
We need to
printed
look at this. I think I would
movable type on the bottom.
lithograph, not
pretty early for.
lithograph.
Direction of the text,
Mhm.
right?
Well, yes,
It's
but
a
so
question of-
whether it's lithographic or engraved, they also, who's doing that? Because they need someone who's very good at the calligraphy of the Arabic. Now, this is 100 years after Shaheen, so there are
Yeah.
more people available in France, I assume. No Arabic who could do this.
Yeah, I think there are some type fronts which are donated in the 17th century from the Ottomans, which are then lost, and then they find them again in the 19th century. There's
A lot of overlapping.
It's really hard. I mean, we know that.
one thing they do is that they don't follow the Arabic, they reorient the Latin, right? The Arabic, so it doesn't follow like a traditional edition, which would be you turn it over this way, this is going back. So they reorient it so that the French translation is the primary thing. But
Yeah, that would happen.
And of course, Arabic script is connected, it's cursive.
Yeah, no,
Right, which is why you can't use movable
which is
type
why
very
movable
easily.
type is the
So-
problem always.
So you could make it, but it wasn't very successful. I
No,
mean,
you need big chunks, you'd need,
Not
and
used very
little
often.
gaps.
Yeah, that's not what that looks like.
that's not,
I haven't
I
looked,
mean,
but- Sure, it looks connected.
By the 19th century, they're not using the movable type in Arabic.
well, a little bit of the story I know. I mean, yes, there are some attempts to print with movable type, but you know, it's
Sure, yeah.
not encouraged, and there are lithography is more successful. Places like North Africa, right?
Yeah.
We have a whole collection of lithograph books from Fez, which are late 19th century, lithographically produced Arabic books. Because, but yeah, no, I think we need to look at
We'll
this.
settle this once and for all.
The French letterpress, right? Unless they
The
do the
French-
whole thing with the graphic.
I mean, that's the other way to do it. They make them kind of a. Yeah, I would like to think about this a little bit too. I mean, I feel like this is a really fascinating story, and it's almost like there are two big chapters here that, you know, are distinct, which is sort of that 18th century context of this obscure fellow and the working methodologies of, I don't know, first phase of this project, which was envisioned by a specific group of people for a specific set of reasons, that he finds himself right guy at the right time sort of situation. And then almost a rediscovery, a reinvention, a repurposing of that work by this whole sort of academic scholarly apparatus team in the 19th century. And I was good to ask one specific question. I think one of your slides specifically showed a cutting and pasting.
Mhm.
And I would love to have you talk about, I don't know if we can go back to slide, doesn't matter, but talk about that a little more. What's being cut and pasted by whom and how?
Yes, so it goes back to how Shaheen's copies came into the possession of the French state, basically. So I think what happened basically is that when, I don't know even how Shaheen left the Maoist service, okay, but when the main Maoist in charge, or the Benedictine in charge of the project died, his family got all of his working papers, right? And then these were then sold back to the French state. So when they were sold in 1813, I think, right? So he died in 1794. So it took about 20 years to negotiate the sale of these papers. Then they must have had this huge mishmash of different texts, different Latin translations thrown in with the same with the Arabic edition or whatever, and then they had to sort of paste these into something which they could use. So they have these huge bound collections, which are now available in the archive.
They being the later editors here.
Or either the librarians at the Bibliothèque Nationale,
Yeah.
probably more likely, I think, who some of the editors served in this role as well, so maybe them. They then created, I don't know, like a history of the Fatimids and a history of the historians of the Crusades and the history of, so there's at least 7 volumes, I think, of they're around the same size as the Recueil of Arabic editions, which or Arabic copies which were shaheed. So that's the sort of process. So it's like, okay, here is Ibn al-Athir, here's Ibn al-Adim, here's Abu Shama, and so we just put them all into the same book so we can actually understand what.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, there's a sort of a curious but a little oblique connection with our speaker last week, Brigitte Bedos-Rozac, was talking about the origins of the École des Chartes, and this, which is a post-Napoleonic invention too. As I mean, it's like this, but at the same moment, the French state sort of swallowing up all these these things that were in the possession of monasteries, abbeys, these giant, estates. So suddenly the French state is in possession of this massive stuff and needs to create library apparatuses, schools and study centers to just deal with it. It sounds like your chapter is kind of, in a way, part of that very long project.
I think so.
Yeah, definitely. And to turn it into something else. It's fascinating. Any final questions? Otherwise, thank you, James, very much.